As you may know, over the past few weeks I have been making my way through Jane Austen's novels, but the past week I decided to take a break. Don't worry, I'm gonna get back to her soon, but this past week I have been a little bit busy and I couldn't commit myself to more than 500 pages of Jane Austen. I was in the mood for something a bit lighter and a bit quicker. And whenever I'm in that mood, whenever I want something light and quick to read, there is one author that I always go to because his novels and short stories are always very entertaining, but also in a very silly way that makes them perfect for this mood. And that is mainly because, one, the plots are very ridiculous and at the same time very perfect in the way that the events come together and the coincidences that happen, that makes you feel as if the world is this very organized place where everything happens exactly when it needs to happen. And also the characters are often very eccentric and very funny, and the way they speak, wonderful. It always makes reading the conversations a delight. There's a lot of suspense and the characters often find themselves in troubles or in sticky situations, and even though you read on wanting to know what happens, you never feel that anything serious is going to take place. No real damage or harm is going to happen. The stakes are always so very low, which makes this perfect for light, relaxing reading. And that, combined with the fact that you know a happy ending is coming your way, and even when the ending is not happy in the sense that the characters get what they want, you know that things are going to resolve themselves on a note of peace and calm. I mean, all of those things makes for a really relaxing and light reading experience. Of course, as you know from the title of this video, the author that I'm talking about is P.G. Wodehouse. And if you're familiar with Wodehouse, please let me know what you think of him in the comments below. But if you're not familiar with him and what I have said so far sounds interesting to you, then I really recommend you give him a try. Later on in the video, I'm going to talk about some of my favorites from P.G. Wodehouse, and these can serve as recommendations or good entry points for you to start with. As always, timestamps will be available if you want to skip around. For those of you who don't know who P.G. Wodehouse is, he's a comic English writer who wrote in the 20th century. I think he began writing in 1902 or 1903 and kept writing all the way until he died in the 1970s. He was a very, very prolific writer. I think he wrote around 90 or 100 books just during his lifetime, and there were many more that were published after his death. I would like to take you on a beautiful tour through my vast collection of books and show you all the unique editions that I have, but unfortunately I have none, because his books are really difficult to come by, and whenever I'm reading Wodehouse, I'm reading him on ebooks on my iPad. But I promise you, and I promise myself, that one day, I'm gonna get the complete collection, and it's gonna be, well, it wouldn't fit here. I'm going to have a different shelf for him. P.G. Wodehouse lived a relatively happy life, or at least a fairly happy childhood. And he thought the reason behind the humor in his books is his outlook on life. He thought that people who takes things easily are disposed to see the humor in everything, and this is the essence of his books. It's exactly that he does in his books. He sees the humor in everything, and basically he ignores everything else. This might be an uninformed exaggeration, but I'm sticking to it. I think Wodehouse might have single-handedly invented modern comedy. Again, I know this is a very bold claim to make, but there is not a single joke or trope or funny situation that I've seen in sitcoms or films or modern comedy books or anything that I could not find in one of Wodehouse's books. And what's more, I think many modern comedy writers can really learn a lot from Wodehouse and the way that he did things. One of the most remarkable things about P.G. Wodehouse that you really can't overlook is his mastery of language. First, he had a very hilarious way with words that always cracks me up. Wodehouse's writing is one of the very, very few things that always consistently and frequently make me laugh out loud. And also his use of language was not only funny but also very beautiful. His style is very concise, very easy to follow, very easy to understand, and at the same time very beautiful. You feel like there is a kind of rhythm in the way he put one word after another. If you ask anyone who has ever read anything from P.G. Wodehouse, they would tell you that he has this uncanny ability to craft perfect sentences. And he mixed his mastery of the English language at its best with the slang of the 20s and the 30s, especially the words and the colloquials that young people back then would use. And the effect was this really unique style. Now, I haven't read nearly enough of P.G. Wodehouse's works really to come up with any kind of definitive list of his best works or anything of the sort. But what I can do is that I can talk about some of my favorites so far. Whenever I'm reading P.G. Wodehouse, I'm reading a few short stories here and there, and whenever I'm reading some of his novels, I read a chapter now and a chapter then, because, as I said, I like to get into him and his works as light, fun reads, usually on the side of something else or during times when I'm extremely busy and don't have time to read much. P.J. Wodehouse usually wrote in series or wrote about characters that would reappear again and again in different books. Some of his most popular series is the Jeeves and Wooster series, which is about Bertram Wooster, who is an idiot, an aristocratic idiot who is always finding himself in trouble. And when he himself is not in trouble, he's trying to save his friends, who are even less smart than he is, out of their troubles. Since he doesn't have what it takes to really save himself from whatever he gets himself into, he usually resorts to his butler, Jeeves. And Jeeves is often described as this brainy person who appears exactly when he needs to appear and who always comes up with the perfect strategies and tricks to get his master and his friends out of whatever the situations they find themselves in. And even though Bertram Wooster is the master and Jeeves is the butler, you know that Jeeves is really the one who is running the show. Actually, the Jeeves and Wooster series was my introduction to P.G. Wodehouse. I came across the Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie's adaptation in the 1990s, and I watched those and I absolutely loved them, and then I found out that they were based on this writer, P.G. Wodehouse, so I decided to read the source material and I fell in love immediately. But I think I watched the series for the first time maybe 10 years ago or 8 years ago, and until this very day, whenever I'm reading anything about Jeeves, or even as I say the word Jeeves now, the image that comes to mind is that of Stephen Fry. Stephen Fry, with his perfect pronunciation and enunciation and his eloquence, was really the perfect choice to portray Jeeves. The manners, the way of speaking, everything was just impeccable. And by the way, if you're looking for TV adaptations of Wodehouse's works, then the Jeeves and Wooster series by Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie is highly, highly recommended. And anyway, the Jeeves and Wooster is a really good place to start with P.G. Wodehouse. You can either start with The Inimitable Jeeves, which I think is the first book in this series, or you can start with Carry On Jeeves, where Jeeves and Wooster meet for the first time, or perhaps you can start with the one that I started with, which is Jeeves My Man. Or is it My Man Jeeves? I can't remember. But either way, it's a collection of short stories and it's a really good entry point. Another popular series is the Blandings series. And this is a collection of novels and short stories that take place at Blandings Castle, which is this idyllic paradise. It's supposed to be an ancient castle and it's inhabited by Lord Emsworth and his very large family. I think he has 10 sisters, a few of their husbands, 2 sons and a few other characters that come and stay there. The Blandings stories are very relaxing, very low-key, very humorous, and a good place to start, I think, would be the first book in the series, which is Something Fresh. There is also a BBC adaptation of the Blandings stories, which came out, I think, in 2012 or 2013. I just started watching it about 2 weeks ago and I really recommend it. It's really good. The last series I want to talk about is the Psmith series. And these are a collection of novels and short stories that center around the character, Psmith, who's a young man who's very charming, very elegant, very neat, and very confident. And he conducts himself in a very dignified manner, which gives him this impressive appearance. He's also very talkative, very talkative. The characters are always telling him, like, we've never met someone who talks as much as you. Can you please talk less? All of these qualities, especially how much he loves to talk, combined with his confidence, makes him, in my opinion, one of the funniest characters to read. Especially his conversations with others are always hilarious. If you want to start with this series, perhaps a good place to start is with Smith's first appearance, which would be in a book titled Mike and Smith, but I haven't read that one yet. Or you can start with my absolute favorite, which is a crossover between the Psmith series and the Blandings series, and it's called Leave It to Smith. By the way, Smith is spelled with a silent P at the beginning, and the reason is that Smith, eccentric as he is, thought not unreasonably that Smith was a very common name, and he wanted to distinguish himself from all the other Smiths, and he decided to do that by adding a silent P to the beginning of his name. Very distinguished indeed. Now I have 2 disclaimers to give you about P.G. Wodehouse's works. One is that his stories always follow the same formula or the same structure, which means that if you don't like one of his novels or one of his short stories, chances are you're not going to like any of the others. This might not be the case, but it seems reasonable to me. And actually saying it out loud that all of his stories follow the same formula or structure makes it seem as if reading them would become repetitive or boring at one point, but I don't think so, because the wealth of eccentric characters and all the ridiculous plot lines really make reading Wodehouse at any time a pleasure. My second disclaimer is that Wodehouse's works are quite traditional, especially when it comes to issues like class and gender. So if that's something that bothers you, then yeah, there's that. It doesn't really bother me so much, because when I'm reading Wodehouse, I'm not expecting radical ideas or anything that would subvert the social order or anything of the kind. I come to them as funny, light reading that I'm doing purely for entertainment. If you're familiar with P.G. Wodehouse, let me know in the comments below which ones are your favorites, and if you could recommend any of his works other than the ones that I mentioned outside the 3 series that I talked about, then I'd really appreciate it, because I'd love to get to know his less popular works, and your recommendations would be a good place to start, I guess. And that's all. Next week perhaps I'm gonna get back to Jane Austen. My next stop is Emma, or perhaps I've been reading some of Shakespeare's less popular works, so maybe I'll do a video on one of those and then get back to Jane Austen. I haven't decided yet, but if this sounds like something you'd be interested in, consider subscribing to the channel, turning on the notifications bell. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And finally, if you have been watching so far, thank you and cheers.